Let's talk meteoric descents and dual wielding some high caliber weapons. Today we're talking about the power of the Inceptor Squad in Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd review the Inceptor Squad, a unit that does seem to have found itself to be a competitive staple for the Space Marine faction in 10th. In the video we'll talk over their model and kit briefly, go through their datasheet bit by bit and compare the two weapon options, then talk through some buff synergies and why they're good in game. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. First up, Inceptors are chunky Gravis armoured jump pack infantry, one of the first of the new Primaris range, and in the lore they're basically deployed as spearhead forces to hit the enemy very hard, often deployed from the upper atmosphere, and only slowing their meteoric descent with their jump packs at the very last moment. From there they proceed to obliterate enemy formations with extreme prejudice, armed either with assault bolters or dual-wield plasma exterminators. Initially they came out as a monopose set in that Dark Imperium box set, the launch box for 8th edition, though it was quickly followed up by this multi-part plastic kit, having the option either for the bolters or the plasma guns. Currently it's £35, €45 or $60 from Games Workshop. As with a few of these 3 Marine Space Marine kits, it's a little bit low on the points per dollar as 40k goes, though generally Inceptors have tended to cost a bit more than things like Blade Guard or Aggressors for example. You do also have the option of picking them up at a slight discount if you pick up the Dark Angels Combat Patrol box set, so bear that in mind as well. Miniatures wise, they're certainly one of the Primaris range that isn't exactly universally loved. Some people really like them, I've seen a fair few people criticising them for the slightly awkward posing, and perhaps the graph plates on their feet look a little bit non-obvious for how they're functioning, at least when you first look at the model. The curved stem flying bases are a little bit on the weird side, I'd say, as well. Can be issues either with them being a little bit loose, or for people who choose to glue them, then the chance to snap off. I personally chose to magnetise mine, and I found that worked quite well. Otherwise, they're at least relatively straightforward models, the main choices being the choice between a sort of blast shield face visor or the more standard Space Marine head, and the choice of the different weapon options. If you were thinking about picking up a box of them, then bear in mind that there's other places that can be a bit cheaper than Games Workshop, places like Element Games in the UK or Gap Games in Australia, both of them links down in the video description below, usually having them around about either 15% or 20% off, can be a bit cheaper compared with the GW price. Getting onto their rules though, and the Inceptor Squad in Warhammer 40k 10th are 115 points or 230 for a squad of 6, though generally the way that people tend to go in more optimised lists is running 3 of them rather than a bigger squad. A big squad could maybe be a little bit more effective for things like stratagems if that was a big deal, but in general people see the utility of having multiple units of them drop in different places generally outweighs that. Toughness wise, they're fairly chunky Gravis armoured Space Marines. Toughness 6, a 3+ save and 3 wounds keeps them at least fairly safe from small arms. They are going to lose casualties really quite quickly when the enemy starts pointing anti-tank weapons against them though. They are pretty efficient against this kind of target. I guess it can at least be a somewhat annoying profile to take down if they drop somewhere where the opponent can't get heavy weapons to bear on them though. Otherwise, they're only objective control 1, so they're not going to be bullying enemy units off objectives all that much. Usually if they're contesting something, the enemy will take it. They've got Deep Strike and their Meteoric Descent special rule, which we'll get onto in just a second. And then when they're on the board, they've got a 10-inch move with Fly, not too bad for getting their weapons in range, which are kind of short-ranged at 18 inches. In 10th edition, I'd say the main draw to running the Inceptors in the first place is all about their special rule. Meteoric Descent is, in my opinion, the biggest reason to take them competitively. It's their rule that when they come down from Deep Strike, rather than having to stay somewhere outside of 9 inches away from enemy units, these guys can drop anywhere that's just greater than 3 inches from their models, really quite a lot closer. If they do choose to do this, then it does prevent them charging, but their melee profile isn't exactly the most exciting anyway, with just 3 strength 4 attacks, basically like any other Primaris Space Marine. Dropping outside of 3 inches is incredibly powerful. Usually it's going to mean that your opponent just won't be able to screen these guys effectively, and they could turn up all sorts of inopportune places, either getting lines of sight on things that the opponent really doesn't want to have line of sight onto. And it means that they're particularly good for tactical secondary objectives, things like behind enemy lines or deployed teleport homers. You could potentially have these come down somewhere annoying in the enemy backfield. Know 100% that your opponent just isn't going to be able to screen them out unless they've got a ridiculous amount of bodies on the board, and ideally hide for a turn while you do the action type thing, or just drop down, score a secondary, and open fire on the enemy with their guns. You might even have the option for some big objective shenanigans if the opponent was only holding them with, say, something that was objective control 1 or 2. If they've got the unit just on the far side of an objective, then 3 inches could be enough to actually drop within range of that same objective and take some points directly off your opponent there. That won't happen often, but if it does, then it could be quite a big swing. Overall, I'd say that this one's a very nice rule. Then though, perhaps for the most exciting bit, is the firepower of the Inceptors. They've got the option either of the Assault Bolters or the Plasma Exterminators, and all of these have the Assault keyword, so you can advance and shoot them if you're on the board, gives them quite a big threat range. They both have the Pistol keyword as well, which means that if the opponent does lock them up in combat, they can still blaze away. That's really quite a nice change compared with 9th edition. And they also have both got the Twin Linked special rule, which I feel like sometimes it might have been a negative in the past, but with the new profiles here, I don't really think it's all that bad, particularly as they have come down in points cost compared with 9th at least. It does mean that they're a little bit more well-rounded overall, and it means that they should be able to both deal with lighter and heavier targets at least reasonably efficiently, even if they're maybe not massively skewed to 1. Finally, profile-wise, you've either got the option of the Assault Bolters, which get you 3 attacks at Strength 5, AP -1 and Damage 2 with all those special rules. They do get you sustained hits as well, so a few more hits compared with the Plasma Exterminators there. And then the Plasma Exterminators, like any other plasma weapon, get you 2 different profiles. The lesser one is 2 attacks at Strength 7, AP 2 and Damage 2. Quite cool, they also have Damage 2 there, just innately. Then if you overcharge them, they go all the way to a Strength 8, AP 3 and Damage 3, really quite big hits and pretty murderous against heavy infantry. It is quite nice that these guys aren't so utterly lethal to themselves anymore. If you overcharged one before, then you'd be odds on to lose it. Now it's just the one weapon profile that represents both guns, so you just make a single hazardous roll and it's not quite as bad. If you're trying to decide between the Assault Bolters and the Plasma, here's a breakdown of the damage profiles against a few key targets. I feel like Games Workshop have done at least fairly well to balance both of them here. They both seem to have a fairly solid niche. With the extra hits that you can expect from extra shots and sustained hits too, the Assault Bolters do solidly better against both the Termagants and say Space Marine Intercessors that aren't in cover. Really quite heavily outcompeting the standard Plasma here, and even being decently ahead of the overcharged Plasma, despite the risk of that one killing the Inceptor. Against 3 wound Terminator equivalents, the overcharged Plasma handily wins there. It's actually kind of even against a toughness 9 vehicle like a Rhino, due to the bolters still wounding most of the time with the rerolls. And then the overcharged Plasma wins quite handily against things with a 2+ save and toughness 12, like the Land Raider. Overall from this one, I'd say that if you're not overcharging, it's really quite a big win for the Assault Bolters here. If you are happy to overcharge the Plasma though, then that wins against things like Terminators or very heavy vehicles, but will be a fair bit weaker against marine targets or lighter, and of course you don't have the risk of death with the Assault Bolters, so that weighs into it. With the standard hazardous rolls, unless you throw command point rerolls at them, then you're losing 1 Inceptor every 2 shooting phases, which is quite a big deal. Overall, I think that Games Workshop have balanced these at least fairly well. In competitive lists, I think I've seen slightly more Plasma compared with Assault Bolters, but both of them are definitely used. I think overall they're not really going to be too bad either way, and one or the other will be stronger depending on the matchup. Otherwise, in terms of available buffs, I feel like the Inceptors are okay for some command point expenditure, as their damage output is fairly good, but maybe not to go too crazy on them. They feel like more like a hard-hitting utility unit, as opposed to something that you really build your core strategy around. They do lack some options, like for example, they can't be attached by any characters. Buffs-wise, I guess Oath of Moment could technically help out that damage output, but for the most part it's going to be less effective on Inceptors compared with most of the rest of your army. They already get full rerolls to wounds, so that would just be duplicated there. Otherwise, for combat doctrines, they're generally going to be more useful after they've initially dropped down. Tactical Doctrine could allow you to fall back and shoot, and that might be one of the most useful ones, though they could blaze away in combat with pistols. That might not be always what you want to do if you need to get away from some scary enemy melee. Otherwise, quite a lot of the Gladius stratagems are pretty usable. Storm of Fire can give them ignores cover and potential extra AP. That could genuinely be really quite strong on Assault Bolters trying to take down a squad of Space Marines with 2 wounds. Both of those could be meaningful. If you did need to make a charge in later turns, you could use Honor the Chapter for a little bit more AP, though it's probably not optimal. Perhaps niche use if you just desperately need to kill all of a unit that's on an objective maybe. Armour of Contempt can always be used for a little bit more toughness if it's going to make the difference between them living or dying. I feel like they could be a particularly interesting squad for squad tactics, the one where you get a reactive movement. I had a chance to use that to fairly good effect when someone moved to get line of sight on them, and the Inceptors could then just waltz to the other side of a wall and stay safe for a turn. Definitely kind of nice with a unit that might be dropping behind enemy lines and skirmishing with other enemy units in the backfield. In general, I'd say maybe not worth going crazy with them too much, but if it does make the difference between you wiping out a crucial backfield objective holding unit or something, you could genuinely make life kind of hard for your opponent. Otherwise, for specific chapters beyond the Gladius, I'd say they're perhaps a little bit less affected by chapter choice than most. I think their main draw is to drop in somewhere outside of 3 inches of the enemy and be very disruptive, and hopefully do some secondary objectives while they're at it. For that reason, they don't really need all that much more synergy, and they don't have any unique characters that can attach to them, so maybe the buffs are a little bit on the limited side. Going through the more divergent chapters though, Space Wolves and Blood Angels could certainly help in melee for some follow-up charges. Black Templars could make them a little bit tougher with a 6+ feel no pain. Dark Angels do have some relevant shooting stratagems, though I'd say they're all maybe a little bit weak on the Inceptor Squad. One command points to return fire though could perhaps be an unexpected burst of damage. Lethal hits and ignore cover just seem a little bit low value for 1 CP though. Otherwise, Deathwatch have got several turns worth of meaningful range damage boosts. Again, the special issue ammo strats could be useful, but probably not an optimal target of them compared with kill teams, I'd say. In general though, I'd say they do what they do pretty well, fairly useful for most chapters, maybe a little bit stronger in the Gladius than most though perhaps. Overall though, I would rate Inceptors as a pretty strong unit for Space Marines in Warhammer 40K right now. In looking at a whole bunch of competitive lists, they do seem to be taken really quite regularly, most commonly in units of 3, and both the Assault Bolters and Plasma Exterminators seem very viable. For strengths and weaknesses, I'd say their biggest strength is the ability to set up anywhere greater than 3 inches, they can almost never be screened out, and their excellent insurance to be able to do some hard secondary objectives that might have otherwise been impossible, and they combine that with really quite good damage output, hitting most targets at least fairly hard with the built-in wound rerolls, and you can choose if you want them to be better against infantry or better against terminators or heavies. For weaknesses, I'd say the damage output's good, but maybe not the absolute top of mainline damage dealers for Space Marines, and they perhaps don't make quite as good use of Oath of Moment given their inbuilt rerolls already. Hazardous rolls are an obvious risk if you're using Plasma, and I feel like while their pistol rule is pretty helpful for them getting locked up in combat, it could still leave them in a tricky situation if they do just get countercharged. Do you just stay in combat with something that's probably going to wipe you in the fight phase? It might still not be the best idea even if you get some damage in. Broadly though, very usable. I feel like a unit or two of them would generally make a Space Marine list stronger for the most part. Let me know what you make of these guys though, how would you rate the Inceptors at the moment, and how they've been getting on in game for you. Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below, and I'd also certainly be very interested to hear which you're preferring out of the Assault Bolters or the Plasma Exterminators these days. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.